Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Going to look at another hand from the 50K PPC from this summer, and this time it's going to be a limit hold'em blind battle that took place kind of late on day one against a strong player. It's kind of interesting when you play in the super high stakes mixed game tournaments that the limit hold'em rounds end up playing kind of a lot more like a tough high stakes limit hold'em cash game in my experience. Whereas when I play smaller stakes horse events and 8 game tournaments, I do feel that the typical players are less comfortable with the limit hold'em rounds and end up playing them very kind of nitty and carefully. But yeah, early on in a 50K, I'm just looking to play complete chip EV cash game poker. So we're going to look at two things here today. We're going to look at the pre-flop ranges for this blind on blind situation just to give you guys a little bit of a familiarity with that, and then we're going to take a quick look at the actual hand. So the first thing I'll just note here is that this is just going to be some solver GTO opening range from the small blind here. We can kind of see that he's got pretty much everything reasonable and just folding the weakest suited deuce hands and some of the weakest offsuit hands. And then we can look at my defense range, and this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting. So what you're looking at here is the calling range in yellow. So when you see these grayed out boxes, these are not folds, they're hands that would have raised. So the only hands in this whole chart that would have folded are down here: 6 deuce, 7 deuce, and 3 deuce off. The rest of these hands that are grayed are mixing raises. One thing that I think is kind of interesting about the blind battle dynamic in the big blind here is notice what types of hands are happy to be raising and three betting in the blind versus blind in position here. They're all the very good hands. Of course, we want to build the pot when we have our best hands, and then they're a mixture of suited hands, and they're mostly trying to cover different board textures. So we can see we're pure three betting 5-4 suited, 6-5 suited, mixing a lot of three bets with hands like pure 3-bet 10-4 suited. So why is the solver doing this? Well, it has all these really good hands, and it wants to have some other types of hands that also can be a little bit deceptive on certain board textures. One thing I observe in a lot of live players and a lot of human opponents is they will 3-bet too many hands over here in this top left corner that are not leaving them any board coverage on the Broadway boards when they just call pre-flop. So for example, the solver never wants to 3-bet here with king queen offsuit, and that is the hand I held in this hand that we're going to look at here. So just familiarize yourself with this a little bit and kind of get an idea of the idea behind the strategy here. I think it's kind of interesting. There are some 3-bets being mixed with some of these big and little offsuit combos, so I shouldn't say never, but there are more coming from these suited combinations. Okay, as we go to look at the hand, I decided to just flat in the big blind with king queen off. The flop came jack 10-8 rainbow and my opponent bet. We can see this looks like a pretty good strategy for him. The solver is mixing in some checks, but he can more or less bet his range here. If he's betting 83%, it can't be that big of a deal to bet his range. And if we look at equity of his range versus mine, we see that the small blind is 56% hot and cold on this board. So this mid-high texture is just kind of good for the pre-flop raiser. He folded some of his weakest hands pre that I've defended, and he has all the premiums that I would have 3-bet pre. So he's just beating me on this board. In game, I thought that king queen off should go ahead and raise here facing a bet. And as I take a look at the solver output here, we can see that this appears to have been a little bit misguided. It is fine to raise with king queen offsuit here, and in fact we can see that it's happening a sliver of the time to make sure that we are protecting both our call and our raising ranges with these sort of hands. But why is it really not raising on the flop with king queen offsuit too much? Well, we can answer that by looking very quickly at what will happen when we do raise. Look at what hands are folding when we raise. Look for the blue. Well, obviously all these nothing hands, right? But look at the other hands that are folding that are blue. A lot of hands that contain a king. King 6 with no backdoor flush draw, 5, 4, 3, 2. All these with no backdoor flush draw are folding, along with, look at all these king 6, king 5, king 4, king 3, king 2 offsuit combinations. That is a lot of hands, and all of them have a king. In fact, the king is probably the single most likely card for villain to hold to fold to the flop raise. Well, when I have king queen, I'm basically semi-bluffing, right? I'd prefer my opponent fold. So it appears that I don't really want to have the king in my hand because that is making it less likely that he's going to have a hand that should fold. So kind of an interesting thing to look at, and you can use the solver to sort of backfill the strategy and understand why it's choosing certain hands to do certain things more frequently. One other thing that's kind of interesting here is how often the villain is supposed to 3-bet the flop here out of position. He does have that kind of nut advantage on this board with all these big cards, and we can see the solver wants to do a lot of 3-betting from his perspective. But in-game, villain just called. The turn was a 6 of spades. I held king queen with 1 spade, and I just felt that this was a good enough card for me to go ahead and continue semi-bluffing, hoping to get my opponent to fold ace high. I was aware in game that if my opponent didn't fold the turn, I was likely to give up on some rivers. It didn't seem very likely to me that my hand would want to go for 3 barrels. I'm thinking on the turn I'm getting the ace high to fold. If the river comes a brick, I'm thinking I'm no longer getting the ace high to fold. We'll go ahead and check to see if that strategy is sound. My plan in game was more or less to give up if I got called on the turn. I did bet, and we can see that the solver looks pretty happy to go ahead and bet here. And we do notice that villain is folding some ace highs in this situation. So now I am successfully targeting a bunch of those ace x hands that didn't pick up a backdoor flush draw, and all these ace x offsuit hands that peeled. So it does appear that my play had some merit. We also can see that villain is really playing very passively now. He already was supposed to 3-bet the flop with all of his good hands, so he doesn't have too many strong holdings left in his range. He has a few, but not too many. In game, he called again, and the river was an offsuit queen. Before we look at what happens on the offsuit queen, which is the actual river, I want to go ahead and just see if my strategy was sound. If the river's an offsuit deuce, for example, my plan was to give up with the king queen, and I want to see if the solver agrees with that. And it appears that it was a good idea to give up with king queen here. We can look at the difference in EV, and it looks like it's a substantial mistake to try to bluff with this hand here in this situation. It's over 20 out of 100, so about 20% of a big bet error to bluff with king queen in the situation. So I'm feeling pretty good about my intention for the hand and my play, even though the flop play was kind of the low frequency one. We can see that we have just better hand combinations to choose from for bluffing here, and it's going to be really easy for us to over bluff on this offsuit deuce. We have all sorts of hands like queen 7, missed flush draw, a bunch of queen highs, really random combos like 9-4. I mean, we have a lot of potential bluffs on this board, so it's going to be extremely easy to overbluff. And we can see that villain is not folding very many ace highs, so king queen does not have a lot of incentive to bet here. He's not getting too many better hands to fold anymore. In game, the river was a queen. I thought this was kind of an interesting card. I thought at first I did think that villain would maybe play some leads on this card, the obvious straight being out there, but it kind of looks like that's not a huge part of his strategy. Of course, 12% leads is substantial, but not a huge part of his strategy, and I would guess that if he played 0 leads, it wouldn't cost him any EV. I thought in-game I could definitely value bet on this card. My thinking at the time was that villain is just going to have a ton of one-pair hands that are going to be put in a difficult situation, and I would have to really, really get creative to find some bluffs on this card, so I really wanted to go pretty aggressively for value. Thinking in it now, I'm really having a hard time stretching to find what bluffs we can find. Let's see what the solver finds for bluffs here. I'm sorry, I clicked the wrong button. Let's see what bluffs the solver can even find here, because it is really hard at this point to find a bluff. It looks like there are some king X hands that are still bluffing. The solver has a little bit of king 7, king 5, king 7 suited, picking up the spades, maybe being one of the only few combos. This is probably not even enough bluffs. We need to find some more. It looks like 7-5 suited would have mixed some raises on the flop at some frequency. But look down here. The solver's probably straggling so hard to find bluffs on this river that it is now turning a bunch of ace highs into bluffs on this run out. That is kind of interesting, because at this point it needs more bluffs. So I think that these hands being bluffed in this situation shows that this is kind of a card where it's kind of hard to find bluffs. And we can see that my king queen is a good value bet here, but I do notice that a hand like king jack is now checking, or ace jack is pure checking. So the solver is sort of saying, well, Jack has now fallen in my value range. I now have all these 2 pairs, straights, and queen X hands that are good enough to value bet. It doesn't want to reopen the action when the hand is weak as a jack. One final thought about the hand. I did think in-game that I would get check raised on this card at decent frequency. If I were the villain and I were out of position here, a thought that would go through my head is, this is a really good card for me to turn a hand into a bluff. I would have a number of potential combinations that would maybe want to bluff. Any hand in my range that contained an ace or a king would certainly be tempting. I think it could be easy for villain to over check raise bluff in the situation if they're an aggressive player. And let's see what the solver likes. It does indeed want to throw in some check raise bluffs, low frequency with some of these ace X suited hands when it misses the flush. And does it have any king X to bluff with? Not really. It doesn't want to bluff with a hand that has a pair in it, so it's not bluffing with a hand like king 10 or king 8. But it looks like some of these ace X hands would be indeed tempted to turn into a bluff. I thought I might get over bluff raised in this situation, and I was prepared to call the raise. And I think that when I looked this up, I was happy to see that my instinct was right. Notice that king queen is calling the raise, whereas a hand like queen jack with top 2 is actually mixing in some folds and has lower EV overall. I find this to be a pretty fascinating situation, because villain is basically representing ace king for the most part when he check raises the river. The number one hands that he's raising for value here all contain a king or I guess ace 9 and 9 9, but ace king and king 9 are certainly prominent in his value check raising range. So it turns out that when I do get raised on this river, blocking a king is kind of a huge deal, and it makes it much more likely that villain has those ace x bluffs or something else, and now a hand like Queen Jack is unblocking the value hands. So I find that to be a pretty kind of cool pattern to be aware of, that my hand can be thin to value bet, but happier to call the raise than a hand like top 2. So some very neat things to see in this hand. In game, the result was a little anticlimactic. Villain check folded, but we can see that he's supposed to do that with a decent part of his range. In fact, he's even folding hands as good as King 10. So I do think a lot of people would fold here, and hopefully I could find a creative bluff every now and then, because this is definitely a board where it would be difficult to bluff. Thought this was kind of a cool blind versus blind hand to check out. Some neat things coming out of PioSOLVER here, and let me know what questions this raises for you. I do find limit hold'em blind battles to be pretty fascinating, a very difficult game within the game, and certainly in the 50K, a lot of tough opponents that are going to make life difficult as well. So I'm just trying to play these spots as good as I can, and studying them in PioSolver is always a good way to improve our frequencies and understand what we're trying to accomplish in hands. So let me know what questions you guys have. See you guys in the comments, and talk to you soon.